In this presentation, I'll be introducing you to some of the quotations that I consider to be the most significant in the play. It is not an exhaustive list, and you will want to add to it, but it should give you the opportunity to approach any question on the play. Before we delve into quotations, it is absolutely essential with this text, probably more than any text that you study, that you are aware of the relevant context surrounding the play. There are two relevant contexts to the text. The first is Edwardian England of 1912, and when the play is set, and there is 1945 post-World War II Britain when the play is first written and performed. So if you're talking about audience reaction, you are not talking about a 1912 audience. Instead, it is necessary for you to consider how an audience of 1945 would react to the events on stage. So England in 1912, First World War is 2 years away, and the sinking of the Titanic happens later that year. Both of those events are significant when we consider some of the comments made by Mr. Birling. He says there isn't a chance of war and that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Both of those references undermine Mr. Birling to an audience of 1945 who are well aware that both of these events have subsequently happened. And undermining Birling is essential to Priestley's purpose in the play. In 1912, we also have a rigid class structure where the upper and middle classes have no desire or appetite to change that class structure, and a gender hierarchy in which women are subservient to men in a patriarchal society. The society of 1945 has changed somewhat. The Second World War has just ended. As a result of that, class distinctions are significantly reduced because of the collective effort required during World War II. Importantly, women have established for themselves a much more valued place in working Britain, having taken on stereotypically masculine roles during the war. Jobs such as agriculture, labouring, manual work, factory work, the making of weapons, all roles that women took on. Part of Priestley's purpose is appealing to an audience with a real appetite for social change. Clement Attlee's Socialist Labour Party has won a landslide victory over the more right-wing Conservative Party led by Winston Churchill. So it is no coincidence that Priestley sets his play in 1912, but writes it and has it performed in 1945, because in front of his actors is an audience which is receptive to the messages that he is delivering here, which is receptive to the notion that society needs to change. Before the action begins, Priestley gives us a list of long and detailed stage directions. These are a list of the ways in which Priestley wants the play to be performed and the way in which he wants the audience to react to the characters as they appear on stage. He describes that the lighting should be pink and intimate at the start of the play. And here I think pink and intimate refers to the protective and comfortable capitalist bubble that the Birling family find themselves in. They are protected in some way from the realities of Britain outside their comfortable home. It has to be comfortable like this for Priestley because he wants us to see the dramatic impact that the inspector brings upon the Birling family. And that is symbolised through the change in the lighting, which should become brighter and harder after the inspector's arrival. That word harder is significant because it connotes something significant, something callous, something jarring, and the inspector has to have this jarring effect on the family. It has to be dramatic. The word brighter, I think, connotes a spotlight of sorts, and to shine a light on something is to reveal the truth. To reveal the truth, the inspector is on stage as the bringer of that truth. He exposes the truth not just of the Birlings' role in Eva Smith's suicide, but he also exposes the truth of the conditions of of the working classes in the world outside, a truth which would otherwise be denied to the audience were the inspector not there. Mrs. Birling is described in the stage directions as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. This is absolutely essential for Priestley's message. Let's not forget that Mr. Birling, as a man in this patriarchal society of 1912, should be the dominant partner. But Priestley makes it very, very clear to us that in fact, socially at least, Mrs. Birling is superior. And this undermines Mr. Birling. But at the same time, it also undermines Mrs. Birling because we are forced to recognise that she has been forced to marry below her social status. And undermining these two characters is absolutely crucial for Priestley. He wants us to ignore their capitalist rhetoric throughout the play, and therefore seeing them as belittled in some way is important for the audience. Eric is described as being half shy, half assertive, and the repetition of half here establishes the notion that Eric is not a complete character. He does not feel confident about his identity. Half shy, he is inclined to take a step back. Half assertive, he wants to be bolder and braver, but can't quite do it. It's important to consider why Eric is so conflicted at the start of the play. And I think it's because he's trying to live up to a set of expectations. First of all, he's trying to live up to the expectations of his father, Mr. Birling. He's very much living in his shadow. But just as importantly, I think he's trying to live up to the expectations of masculinity in this patriarchal society. A society which demands that a man is dominant. A society which demands that a man be married, to be the head of a household, to be the breadwinner. And Eric is struggling to live up to society's expectations of him. In some ways, I think Eric also mirrors the men in the audience of 1945. Let's not forget they've just returned from World War II to a society which has changed, to a society where women have taken on a more significant role in working Britain. And so the certainties of gender are no longer there, and men can no longer be absolutely certain of their role in society. In that way, I think Priestley wants the men of his audience to grow with Eric during this play, to change with Eric as the play progresses. Sheila is described as materialistic and immature at the start of the play. She is rather pleased with life and very excited. But it's the way she addresses her mother, Mrs. Birling, which is most revealing. "Mummy, isn't it a beauty?" she says, referring to the ring that Gerald has just given her. The use of mummy here paints Sheila as being very childish and immature. But like with Eric, Priestley leaves Sheila with room to grow and develop. And that's absolutely crucial because it's that younger generation that Priestley is keen to see change and grow as a result of his play. The ring is clearly very important to Sheila. I'll never let it go out of my sight for an instant. On the one hand, that certainly paints Sheila as being materialistic and concerned with appearances. But I think we do have to feel some sympathy for this woman. Finding a husband, securing herself a husband, is absolutely crucial for her if she is to secure her future and to secure her social status. However, the female audience of 1945, which has just established for itself a sense of independence in working Britain, is likely to feel frustrated and probably quite angry about a character who, in their eyes, represents a step backwards. Mr. Birling tends to dominate Act 1, certainly in the early stages. His long speeches take control of the stage and proceedings. But Priestley doesn't allow him to dominate in the eyes of the audience, and he undermines him constantly. In this line here, we really get a summary of Birling's opinion on society, as if we are all mixed up together like bees in a hive. And it's the sarcasm of this line which is significant. Birling refuses to recognise the notion that we should be like bees, to work together for a common cause. Birling is much more driven by a selfish capitalist ideology founded upon individual gain. Priestley is keen for us to criticise that notion. It is the inspector who he introduces to the play as the source of this change. And in the opening stage direction for the inspector, he is described as creating at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. It also says that the inspector need not be a big man. He is not physically large, but he is large symbolically. He is massive because he represents so much more than just a character on the stage. First of all, he is a representative figure for the working class of Britain, a segment of society which is otherwise denied a voice in this play. He is also symbolic of Priestley's voice. This is the mouthpiece for Priestley. This is the character who will deliver Priestley's messages in the play. And it is therefore crucial for Priestley that we see the inspector as this dominant figure, this figure to be listened to as soon as he arrives on stage. It is Sheila that the inspector has the immediate impact on. And we see this in Sheila's line directed to her father. But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. A character who was initially so concerned with materialism and appearances at the start of the play has quickly changed into a character which is starting to see the humanity of the working classes outside her home. People is in italics here. That is emphasised for importance and significance. Sheila is in some way recognising her solidarity with these women, unlike her father who views them as cheap labour, as tools and a way for him to make money. What is also significant about this line is the idea that Sheila is taking on her father here. This is an act of defiance. And so she is not only revealing a change in her character, but she is also changing the gender dynamic in the play. She should be subservient to her father, but here she is starting to dominate him. That change in the gender dynamic reaches its peak at the end of Act 1 through the stage direction. She looks at him almost in triumph. He looks crushed. This is an exchange between Sheila and Gerald. And it is Sheila who is now in a position of absolute dominance. Don't forget, at the start of the play, Sheila is utterly dependent upon Gerald for social position. That is why the engagement ring is so important to her. But now she has disregarded that and she has started to dominate him. And it is Gerald who has become subservient to her. He is crushed. Mrs. Birling is the character who probably changes least as a result of the inspector's intervention. And we see that in her arrogance and disregard for the working classes throughout the play. Girls of that class is a dismissive, sarcastic line, which really shows her heartlessness. But what is significant is the hyphen at the end of that quotation. She has been interrupted, and she has been interrupted by Sheila. So Sheila not only starts to dominate her father, but her mother as well. We see Sheila as an increasingly progressive character during the play. That's absolutely crucial if Priestley is to successfully deliver his message about gender equality. And it is Sheila who becomes increasingly wise and realises the truth of what the inspector is trying to achieve. She says to her mother, "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, he'll just break it down." Well, the wall here is of course symbolic of the divide that the Birlings are trying to put up between themselves and the reality of the working classes in the outside world. And it is a wall that Priestley is seeking to break down. He wants to break down class divide in the society of 1945. And he reveals, therefore, through Sheila and the inspector, the inevitability of that barrier being broken down. Sheila's dominance continues through her exchanges with Gerald. Gerald has had his interactions with Eva Smith revealed, and there appears in some sense to be an act of kindness on Gerald's part. He puts Eva up in the lodgings. But of course, Gerald's motivation is entirely self-centred. He is kind to Eva to make himself feel better about himself, to make himself feel dominant and powerful in some way. He wants to be the prince, the saviour, the male character who rescues the damsel in distress. And in this line here, Sheila takes that all away from him by calling him the fairy prince. And in doing so, she emasculates him and reduces his male power, and again gains dominance over Gerald in the process. Birling and Mrs. Birling prove difficult to break down, but here we see the inspectors starting to have an impact upon them. Their exchanging of bewildered and rather frightened glances reveals to us that their arrogance and power and dominance and refusal to change that we see in Act 1 and early in Act 2 is starting to be broken down. And that foreshadows the breakdown of this family that we see at the end of the play. Eric begins to change in the same way as Sheila does. He is the only other character apart from Sheila who starts to accept his responsibility in all this. After leaving the house, he returns in Act 2, and the stage direction tells us that he meets their inquiring stares. Well, in accepting the stares of the characters on the stage, he is accepting their judgment, and in doing so, accepting his responsibility and his role in Eva Smith's suicide. He is revealing to us, like Sheila does, the importance of social responsibility and the importance of remorse, something which Gerald, Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling fail to show us. The inspector then goes on to reveal to us the kind of character that Eric used to be. He treated Eva Smith like an animal, a thing, not a person, very much like his father. Eric dehumanises Eva, treats her as an object, is physically violent towards her even. And it's important that the inspector reveals this to us, because that shows us, it shows the audience, the extent to which Eric has changed in this play, the extent to which he has transformed. And it is through Eric and Sheila that Priestley reveals to his audience that change is possible. Sheila's emancipation and freedom continues when in Act 3 she hands the ring back to Gerald. Let's not forget, the ring at the start of the play is symbolic of female subservience. The ring is necessary for Sheila to gain social status, and in handing her the ring back to Gerald, she frees herself from those restrictions and allows herself to be an independent woman. This is the moment in the play where those independent women of 1945 are really starting to warm towards Sheila, really starting to empathise and sympathise with her, because she is acting as they want to be seen in the society of 1945. She is acting out on stage the progressive nature of female presence in British society. The inspector's final speech is very much a summation of Priestley's major messages in the play, and he finishes it with the very powerful line, "And if men will not learn this lesson, you will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." Now, this line is particularly powerful for Priestley's audience of 1945, because the fire and blood and anguish is, of course, World War II that they have just lived through. Many of them will also have lived through World War I, or at least had relatives who lived or perished during World War I and World War II. So they are able to recognise that people like the Birling family did not learn their lesson. That is what, in their eyes, has caused World War II and the pain and the suffering that ensued. So it is at this point in the play that they feel especially angry towards the arrogance of the Birling family, and especially frustrated at their refusal to change. Priestley allows Mr. Birling one more arrogant declaration right towards the end of the play, the famous younger generation who know it all. But of course, in allowing him this arrogant expression, Priestley actually undermines Birling, because the audience is well aware that it is actually the famous younger generation who know it all. They have seen Sheila and Eric realise the truth, and so Mr. Birling, in this act of arrogance, makes himself look more ridiculous than he ever has done before. And it also reveals to us that Mr. Birling has not changed in any way, and that he will now be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And that is why it is so important that the phone rings again at the end of the play. This is a warning from the outside world. Bells and doors ringing are interruptions from a world which the Birlings are trying to keep out. And that final ringing of the phone is a realisation that the Birlings have learnt nothing, and they will now be taught this lesson all over again. Doors act similarly as a way of letting in the outside world. Every time a door opens, it is another warning or a realisation from the outside world. The first door opening is the inspector arriving. He brings in those messages from the outside world. He will not allow the Birlings to be protected in their capitalist bubble.